Well, hello and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Gospel Points. I'm your host, Kevin Thompson, and joining us once again is Pastor Joel Tetreau. Pastor Joel is the pastor of the Southeast Valley Baptist Church in Gilbert, Arizona, and the author of the book that we've been talking about and we'll be talking about all week, The Pyramid and the Box, the decision-making process in a local New Testament church. Pastor Joel, welcome back to the podcast.
Kevin, it's great to be back. Thank you.
Well, we talked about in our last podcast, kind of like an introduction about why you'd be drawn to the subject of decision making in the local church. We talked about your allegory of the pyramid of the box, kind of some faulty views of decision making. And let's jump into you talk about the decision makers in the church. Let's talk a little bit about that because we hit on our last podcast about some dangers you mentioned. You mentioned the oligarchy and the anarchy. I'm missing the middle one all of a sudden.
The monarchy, the oligarchy, and that's right, and the anarchy, right.
All right. So when we're talking about decision makers in the church, the most obvious person we're talking about is the pastor, the lead pastor, or senior pastor, or however your particular church has it. And when we talk about the monarchy, that's kind of what comes to my mind in my background, where the pastor is the man. He's the man of God there. You trust him. So we do want to stay away from that dictatorial view of the pastorate. So what should the pastor's role be in decision making? What type of decisions should he make or stay away from?
Thank you. A great question, Kevin. In our book, what we've tried to do is we've divided the book into three sections. The first section asks the question, what is the nature of leadership and decision making, particularly as it relates to the church? And as we look at the scriptures, the New Testament, also the Old Testament, by way of principles, but as we look at the scriptures, what is the nature of decision making in the local church? The second section of the book is where you're asking this question, and that is, who are the legitimate decision makers in the church?
Right.
And then the last section of the book is, how do you once you understand what decision making is, who are the legitimate decision makers? And then lastly, then how then do you go about making healthy decisions in the church? So back to your question, right. I mean, as we ask the question, who then are the legitimate decision makers in the church? What we've done is we've identified 5 different roles, 5 different categories, if you will. And we're saying, as you look at the New Testament church, it seems as if we can identify certain kinds of patterns. Now, there is an acceptable diversity here. There is a sense in which there can be diversity between church and church based on denominational distinctives, based on polity, based on understanding of a variety of things. But no matter what your polity is, I hope, if you say you're a Bible-based church, then I think it would carry a lot of weight. If the scriptures could give us a sense of the kind of decisions the senior pastor was to make, the kind of decisions the elder team, the pastor team together would make, the kind of decisions the deacons would make, then that carries weight. So we asked the question, or you asked the question, what about the senior pastor? I mean, obviously, we've got, passages, where, like in the New Testament, a pastor is not to lord it over, right? He's not to be abusive with his authority. So obviously, he's not to be Godzilla. You don't want a pastor who reminds us of Genghis Khan. But does that mean he has no legitimate leadership? And frankly, as we looked in chapter 2, in the second chapter of our book, we're looking at some key passages. Boy, it just becomes very clear when you look at the text of Scripture, when we have a variety of passages that clearly give the lead pastor, in some churches there's only one pastor, and so we have a variety of scriptures that give us a clear sense that a pastor has a real responsibility. I mean, for instance, a pastor is in a variety of places. In Acts, we have a pastor being called 3 things. He is he's to be a bishop. That means he's got leadership. That means he's got administrative oversight. He is a leader. He is a feeder. So you have presbyteros, which means he's an elder. You have poimen, which is he is a shepherd or a pastor, and then he is an episkopos, which is to say he is a bishop. And so, there is a clear sense in which the scriptures give the senior pastor a variety of responsibilities. Everything from preaching to teaching to admonition. I mean, we have the Apostle Paul explaining to Timothy, his young son in the faith, that he needs to give attention to reading, to exhorting. And so there's just a variety of scriptures that we look at in the book that clearly give a pastor authority. It gives him authority to lead. It gives him authority to preach. It gives him authority to do various decision making. And so, but you asked a good question. I mean, if you had to break it down, and I believe that, frankly, even though a senior pastor or a lead pastor has a variety of responsibilities, personally, I think he's got at least 16 areas of responsibility that we could make an exegetical case for. To me, I can't walk away from a chief responsibility, and that would be shepherding. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. And so there just seems to be a heavy emphasis of shepherding. And if a pastor doesn't have authority to pull off that responsibility of shepherding, in other words, we handcuff the pastor. We don't allow him, the decision-making on what to preach and how to preach. And we don't give him decision-making in the area of Christian education in the church, staffing in the church. I mean, discipline in the church, even how to handle certain inter-church relationships. I mean, all of those kinds of things, let alone doctrinal matters, all of that rests on the shoulders of the pastor. It's not to say he's in a vacuum, and it's not to say that that's divorced from other leaders of the congregation, but they're clearly, I mean, if you look at Revelation, the first 3 chapters of Revelation, John's pretty clear that though, he calls them angels. I take the view that was a pastor. And I know that some don't, but if you take that view, man, there was a heavy hitting responsibility leveled on those key leaders in those 7 churches in Revelation. So obviously the scriptures give the scriptures give a lead pastor significant authority to pull off his responsibility with shepherding.
So next we come into the role of the elder. And some churches may not recognize that role. I think it is a New Testament role. I think that's kind of obvious. But talk to us about that. What is the role of the elder in regards to decision-making in the local church?
So, everything I just said about the senior pastor, I would echo that for the elders. I mean, frankly, in the book we cite, there's just clear indication. I mean, in Acts 15, you certainly have a plurality of eldership going on in the Jerusalem Council. Acts 14:23, I call that the smoking gun. Evidence that there was a plurality of elders in the early New Testament church. Acts 14:23, and when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed and with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And so at least to me, I mean, you take the word presbyteros, elders, and this is on top of my head. It's like I think 54 times it's used in the plural, just a handful of times it's used in the singular. There's like 16 or 17 occasions in the New Testament where a local congregation is said to be led by a plurality of elders. So I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't room exegetically to make a case for a first among equals, but I really believe that if you look closely at the New Testament, the bulk of the decision making that the senior pastor makes is in league with the rest of the elder team.
Right.
So it just seems as if it's pretty clear that you've got multiple elders, pastoring in a congregation, and multiple elders leading. I mean, Philippians 1:1 is, I think, another clear passage. Paul shows up in Philippi. Who meets them? Bishops, plural, and deacons, plural. It's interesting. It was either Clement. It was either one of the early church fathers made. I think it was Clement that made note that there was just one congregation in Philippi, and so you've got bishops, plural, and deacons, plural, meeting the Apostle Paul as he comes in Philippians 1:1. So so we ask the question. Okay, well, what is it that elders do? Well, again, I mean, as you turn to the pages of Scriptures, I mean, we have a very clear sense that there is to be a shared, kind of a shared authority based on just a whole, variety of Scriptures. Again, shepherding. We mentioned that before. The responsibility of shepherding. I'm reminded in Acts, if you remember in Acts 5 or Acts 6, the whole reason why there was the need for what, as many of us would call a proto-deacon there in Acts 6, was because there was a tremendous physical need, and as the spiritual leaders in the early church were saying, hey, we need some physical needs taken care of, the reason behind that was to protect the spiritual leaders, apostles then, elders today. The spiritual leaders needed to have time for ministry of the word and ministry of prayer, and so I would say any ministry, spiritual sphere of ministry that results in decision making. Again, there's some overlap with what we said with the senior pastor, but decisions concerning doctrine, decisions concerning like ordination, and I know that there's overlap with the congregation, but certainly. In Acts 6, you had the spiritual leaders laying their hands on those that would be ordained. Frankly, 1 Timothy 5:17 speaks of those that rule or stand first. And so again, I think clearly the elder team has a responsibility of management or oversight. So I would say those are some of the key, exegetically discernible decision-making areas that the elder team has together. And if you remember, one other thought, if you remember in several of these places, the Scriptures make clear, as the Scriptures are clear in speaking to elders or pastors, hey, take heed to yourself and take heed to your doctrine. So there's a sense in which, a plurality of eldership is healthy because they help one another with accountability when it comes to personal discipline. When it comes to Christian discipline, when it comes to right doctrine, to right living, elders need one another, and so I would say that those are some of the more noticeable decision-making areas that elders have biblically.
All right, we're already out of time for this podcast, but I want to stretch this out just a little bit because I don't want to end this episode without talking about the responsibility of the congregation in all of this. We want to avoid the error of a democracy or an anarchy, which I think is a good way of phrasing that. But the congregation does have responsibility. So talk to us for a minute here about that idea.
So, and one of the things that's a little bit challenging here is that there's no institution that I know of other than the church where at the exact same time you have a senior pastor leading and people submitting to his leadership, and you have the senior pastor, the lead pastor, plus the elders that are leading the deacons in the congregation, and then there are times when the pastors and the elders are submitting to the congregation. I mean, so that can be very confusing, right? I mean, but see, that one of the keys that we'll notice in a biblical approach to decision making is there's this commitment to mutual submission, and so while the Scriptures would give the lead pastor certain areas of responsibility, the Scriptures would give the elders. The Scriptures also give the congregation a variety of areas. Like, for instance, it's very clear. It's very clear from Acts chapter 6 that in other places that, frankly, the congregation was engaged and even involved in who would be part of that deacon team or that proto-deacon team in Acts 6. I mean, it wasn't just the apostles. The multitudes also had a role in Acts 6 of identifying who executive leaders would be. It's clear in other places in the New Testament, congregations were involved in sending out. We see that in Acts chapter 11, Acts chapter 13, frankly, Acts chapter 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I mean, there's just a variety of areas where congregations had a real role in sending out those who would minister on their behalf. Then, of course, there's a whole issue of church discipline. I mean, as you look at Matthew 18, there's a real process. When somebody has failed, there's personal confrontation. If that's not effective, that's followed up with a confrontation by 2 or 3 witnesses. And eventually, if it's not dealt with, then it goes to the body. And if the body has to, then the body can expel disobedient members from the membership. So, congregations send out, they place out, frankly, in one sense, congregations, while the pastor has a real responsibility with doctrine, the congregation has an obligation. I mean, if you read the epistles, I mean, it's almost like every epistle is warning congregations or churches to beware of false teachers. And so, there's a number of these responsibilities given to congregations, including, and perhaps one of the most important things is to make sure that you have wise, biblical, godly leaders that are leading the congregation.
Well, thank you, Pastor Joel. We're gonna stop there, and we're gonna pick up our conversation on Friday. Again, the name of the book we're talking about is The Pyramid and the Box, written by Joel Tetreau, and we'll have links to that on our website where you can purchase that. And again, we encourage you to do that. Well, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you'll come back on Friday as we continue this conversation.